Name the American officer who wrote a 14-page report explaining why his mission would fail and was ordered to lead it anyway. You cannot. Almost nobody can. April 3rd, 1942. A corner office of the War Department. The report sits on the desk, single-spaced, maps appended. The conclusion on the final page. Operationally unfeasible. The lieutenant colonel who wrote it is waiting for his boss to sign it and kill the project. He is 35. Coast artillery. Career staff. 0 combat commands. The general across the desk looks up and says, "Frederick, I can't sign that." And the lieutenant colonel begins to understand that he is not walking out of this room the way he walked in. His name was Robert Tryon Frederick. By the end of the war, he would be the youngest major general in United States Army ground forces, wounded 8 times, the only general on the National Archives list of most decorated Purple Heart recipients, and the commander of what historian Carlo Diest called the most successful unconventional unit ever fielded by the United States Army in World War II. None of that was visible in the spring of 1942. What was visible was a Coast Artillery staff officer who had just written a devastating critique of a project nobody wanted to touch. This is a story about what happens when the institution hands a problem to the one person honest enough to say it is broken. To understand Frederick, you have to understand the trap Eisenhower was in. Project Plough was a civilian idea. Its author, a British eccentric named Geoffrey Pyke, had imagined a commando force dropped by parachute into occupied Norway, riding a tracked snow vehicle that did not yet exist to destroy the German heavy water plant at Vemork and raid Alpine hydroelectric targets in Italy. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, championed the plan. Winston Churchill sold it to General George Marshall at the Chequers Conference in March 1942. Franklin Roosevelt signed on. By the time the file reached the Operations Division of the War Department, the political commitments had already been made at the highest level of 2 governments. Eisenhower, then a major general running that division, needed an honest military assessment. He handed the file to the officer running his current section, a lieutenant colonel named Frederick, and Frederick gave him exactly what he asked for. I think this detail matters more than most people realize. Eisenhower did not want a yes man. He wanted the truth. What happened next is what the institution did with the truth once it had it. Identity anchor established here, returned to exactly once at the verdict. Frederick was the officer who wrote the memo explaining why the mission would fail. That is the anchor. Everything in his biography points toward why he was going to be that officer and nobody else. He was born in San Francisco in 1907. At 14, he lied about his age and joined the California National Guard. At 15, he lied again and joined the Maritime Union. A young man with a problem accepting institutional limits. He went to West Point, graduated in 1928, and yet on the same day he pinned on his commission, married Ruth Harlow of Brooklyn. 10 months before Pearl Harbor, from a desk at Fort Shafter in Hawaii, Major Frederick wrote a 6-page staff study predicting almost exactly how Japan would attack Oahu. It went nowhere. By August 1941, he was on the War Department General Staff. Eisenhower's fitness report on him read, highly intelligent, hard-working, superior organizer, sound judgment, general officer material. What Frederick did not have in the spring of 1942 was any of the things the job he was about to get actually required. No airborne experience, no commando training. No mountain warfare, no winter warfare, no infantry combat command. He had never jumped out of an airplane in his life. He had never led men into fire. On paper, he was exactly the wrong man for Project Plough, which is part of what made him the right one. The spine. One central incident, the report, the assignment, the building of the force. 2 soldier testimony moments, 1 cost beat. CTA at approximately 47%. Here is what we know about the report. Frederick spent 12 days on it, 14 pages, single-spaced with maps. The conclusion was surgical. There were not enough transport aircraft in the spring of 1942 to drop the force into Norway, let alone resupply them. Any force that went in would leave its equipment behind and walk out through snow. Strategic bombing could cripple the same targets at a fraction of the cost. Small teams of Norwegian saboteurs who knew the terrain and language should do the job instead. which, as it happens, is exactly what eventually succeeded at Weymouth in February 1943. The report went up. Eisenhower was in London when it landed. He returned on April 3rd. He called Frederick in. "Frederick, I can't sign that." "Well, why, General?" "Because I just told them in London we would go ahead full speed with the project." That is the whole moment. Churchill had committed, Mountbatten had committed, Roosevelt had committed, Marshall had committed. An early American front in Europe was hanging on it. The critique was correct, and it did not matter. On the 9th of June, 1942, Eisenhower gave Frederick the assignment in 2 sentences, recorded in Frederick's own notes at the Hoover Institution. "Frederick, take this Plough project. You've been over the whole thing. You're in charge now. Let me know what you need." Frederick, modest to a fault, protested that he was completely unqualified. He accepted anyway. In my view, this is the hinge of the story. The Army did not pick a commando, on paper and in detail, that the unit could not exist. A skeptic who cannot kill a project will either engineer it into something survivable or be blamed when it fails. Frederick chose the first path. Within weeks, he eased the British civilian Pyke out. He renamed the unit the 1st Special Service Force, a deliberately boring designation meant to fool German intelligence into thinking it was a morale and entertainment outfit. He brought in the Canadians, built an integrated command structure down to the platoon, and picked Fort William Henry Harrison outside Helena, Montana, for the activation on the 9th of July. What he did in Montana violated almost every Army norm of its era. He parachute qualified the entire unit within 48 hours of arrival. No jump towers, no rehearsal flights. He was first man out the door of the first aircraft, making his first ever parachute jump in civilian low-quarter shoes because his jump boots had not arrived. Every man was airborne qualified regardless of branch, cooks included. He commissioned a stiletto fighting knife, the V-42, and carried one of the 3 prototypes for the rest of the war. He authorized a red arrowhead shoulder patch with USA on one edge and Canada on the other. The only American unit ever permitted to wear Canada on the sleeve. It is still the branch insignia of United States Army Special Forces today. The men noticed what kind of officer had shown up. A staff officer at Monte la Difensa later wrote, "With bullets raking the air, Frederick moved from unit to unit." His casual indifference to enemy fire is hard to explain, for there were times when barrages of mortar sent us all scurrying for cover, only to come back and find him sitting in the same position and place we had vacated in a hurry. Another young officer wrote, "I will never forget him walking by my position and telling me to keep my head down, while he was in full view of the enemy." That was the staff officer skeptic from Washington, 18 months after the memo. The force paid for that leadership. At Monte la Difensa in December 1943, Frederick's men climbed a sheer cliff face in rain and darkness and took a 3,000-foot peak that had stopped conventional divisions for weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Tom McWilliam, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, was killed leading his men forward. At Anzio, the force held 13 kilometers of front for 99 continuous days. They went out at night with faces blackened and the V-42 at their belts, and a German officer killed on patrol wrote in his diary that the Black Devils were all around every time his unit came into the line, and they never heard them come. Of the roughly 1,800 combat troops Frederick trained at Fort Harrison, more than 2,000 casualties rolled through the unit by the fall of 1944. Over 100%. The price of proving the critic wrong was paid, as it always is, by the men who had written none of the memos. I want to be fair here. There is a legitimate argument that Frederick's original report was correct, and the force's success vindicates him personally, not the assignment. The Army quietly disbanded the 1st Special Service Force on the 5th of December 1944. Frederick himself had written to 5th Army Headquarters that February, suggesting the unit be allowed to pass out of existence while it is still in its prime, rather than to sustain it through a period when it will be remembered only for its faults and defects. He knew what conventional employment was doing to his men. The Rangers, the Marauders, and the OSS were all dissolved in the same stretch of war. I think that is an honest point, and it deserves its weight. But there is a difference between the mission failing and the unit succeeding at a different mission entirely. The Norway Plan died correctly. What rose in its place was something Frederick built out of his own skepticism. And every Green Beret alive today wears the patch he designed. The institution almost always punishes the honest subordinate. It promotes the yes man and sidelines the memo writer. What is remarkable about this story is that Eisenhower did the opposite. He read the critique and decided the critic was the only person left in the room who understood the problem well enough to redeem it. Frederick did not want the job. He said so. He took it anyway and rebuilt a project he had argued against into a unit nobody had authorized him to build. He was the officer who wrote the memo explaining why the mission would fail. He was right about the mission. He was wrong about himself. That is the rarest thing a man can be in uniform. Right and wrong at the same time, about the same piece of paper. I want to name the systemic pattern here because this was not just about one man. The institution handed Frederick a politically irreversible project and told him to make it work. That is a specific kind of assignment, and it happens everywhere. A leader commits to a launch date before engineering has signed off. A general tells a prime minister yes before asking his operations division. And then the file lands on the desk of the one person honest enough to say no, and the only way forward is to hand it to them. What the institution almost never does is what Eisenhower did next, which was to give the skeptic real authority and real resources, and let them change the mission into something that could actually succeed. That part is the exception, not the rule. The rule is that the skeptic gets the project with none of the authority and is then blamed when it collapses. And if that sounds familiar, if you have watched someone in your own organization get handed an impossible assignment and told to own the outcome, or if you have ever been that person, then the Frederick story is not a war story. It is a working document. The lesson is not that skeptics should shut up. The lesson is that the ones who accept, build, and remain honest about the cost are how institutions actually change. Frederick finished the war commanding the 45th Infantry Division. His men liberated Dachau and took Munich. He was promoted Major General at 37, the youngest in Army Ground Forces. He was wounded 8 times. 3 of those came on a single day in Rome, on the 4th of June, 1944, when he was hit in both thighs and one arm leading his force into the city. One wound took 256 stitches. He checked himself out of the hospital to rejoin his men. The 1st Special Service Force was disbanded in southern France a week after Frederick left. He was not there. 16 years later, retired, he walked onto Fort Bragg and handed the original force colors to the 7th Special Forces Group. Every Green Beret in the United States Army and every operator in Canadian Special Operations traces lineage through him. He died in 1970 at 63. He is buried in the San Francisco National Cemetery at the Presidio, a mile from the house he grew up in. The report that started it was 14 pages. It said on the final page that the mission would fail. Frederick signed it, sent it up, and did not understand what he had just written. He thought he was killing a project. What he was actually writing was the application for his own command. That is the record. What you do with it is up to you. If this story was worth your time, subscribe. There are many more like it coming.